Today it's going to be a short one. We've recapped all of this stuff. We've done it in year 11, so we're going to provide a recap of it for you today. So we're talking about two procedures of acquiring knowledge. And there was a bit of a fight going on in philosophy in sort of 17th, 18th century between what we called continental rationalists, okay? Continental because they come from the continent of Europe. We've got Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. All right, you might remember Leibniz. He's the guy that also invented calculus simultaneously with Newton. And Descartes we've talked a lot about, so he's a pretty important fellow as far as philosophy goes, often described as the father of modern philosophy. Now their perspective of rationalism, that's what they argue for, is going to be contrasted with what we call the empiricists. And that's most famously sort of attributed to John Locke, Berkeley, pronounced Berkeley, and David Hume. So I'll just provide today, we're just going to provide a brief description of the different ways of acquiring knowledge. And then later on in the term, we'll start to look at each individual philosopher. So here's what they are. So rationalism says truth can be discovered through reason. All right? We call it a priori. A priori because it's prior to sense experience. Okay, so that's a word that Kant came up with, a priori, but prior to sense experience. And so they're about logical operations, and it's about deductive reasoning. So classical example, all bachelors are unmarried men. Okay, I am a bachelor, therefore I am an unmarried man. All right, grouping those two things together, they can follow without any sense experience. Okay, it's just logical operations, deductive reasoning. Empiricism says we start as a blank slate, Mercedes, and we accumulate this sense experience, and we use inductive reasoning to tell us about the world around us. Okay, so what's inductive reasoning? You know, I dropped the pen and it fell to the ground. I dropped the pen, it fell to the ground. If I drop it again, it's going to fall to the ground. That's inductive reasoning, right? And this is a posteriori. Okay, it's posterior after sense experience. All right, so we have a priori before sense experience and a posteriori after sense experience. So we're going to look at Descartes and we're going to look at Hume today. So Hume, in his book Meditations, it's a short book. You can listen to the audio book on YouTube for free. It's about 3 hours. All right, and it's well worth having a listen to. And all he does is he talks about himself sitting in a chair, reflecting on what are the things that I can doubt. All right. And remember, he goes through all of those things. How can I know that I'm not dreaming? He sort of throws that radical skepticism on all these things. And he arrives at, we can throw doubt on every single piece of sense experience. Okay? Any piece of sense experience, you can always say, what if you're dreaming? What if you're in the Matrix? You know, there's always that doubt that you can throw on. And so he's saying, we need something that's more fundamental, some bedrock, that's going to be a foundation for sense experience. So sense experience is good. It's not that it doesn't tell us truth, but we need it to rely on something more fundamental. And for Descartes, that's rationalism, okay? And so he's saying, what are these operations that I can arrive at in my mind without sense experience that I can build my whole philosophy upon, okay? And so he famously said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. That's a proposition that he arrives at. And how does he get out of this sort of radical skepticism? Is he does so with God, right? He says, I can reason to God just in my mind. Okay, I can reason to God's existence, and if God exists and God is good, then God's given me the ability to trust my senses. And then he builds up his philosophy from there. All right, so how have we described it in the past? Like, he's going through all the things that he believes about himself, right? I'm a human being, I'm sitting in this chair right now, can I doubt that? He's like, yes. He's trying to get to the bottom. We describe it like a barrel of apples, okay? He wants all of the apples in the barrel to be fresh and true and correct. So he tips everything out, because if there's one bad apple, if there's one bad assumption in our philosophy, it's going to ruin the rest of it, all right? We need all of the assumptions to be fresh and correct, and then we can build up our philosophy from there. So that's what Descartes is doing. And so he says, I can't trust sense experience. What can I arrive at in my mind? I can arrive at God's existence, and if I've got God existing, then I can trust my senses from there. The argument he comes up with, we've mentioned this before, is the ontological argument. So this is a tough argument. People are still talking about it to this day, and it was first developed by St. Anselm about 1,000 years ago now. So it's a deductive argument. So it flows deductively, and this is what people will argue about. Good, there's a marker here. So it says God has every perfection. So if you think about God, all right, and all of the things that God is, God has every perfection. All right. So one of God's attributes, along with omnipotence and omniscience and so forth, all the omnis, is perfection. That God is a perfect being. Okay, that's what we sort of talk about with the classical understanding of God. Like God is perfect. He lacks nothing, has everything. God is perfect. Okay? So that's the first premise. Perfection is a part of God. But then the second premise says, but existence is a perfection. Okay, so it says, if we think of all of these perfections, what is it that makes something perfect? And that might be sort of like completely knowing, sort of beautiful, and all these sort of things that make something perfect. It says existence is one of those. Okay, so then it's like, well, what are the properties God has? God has perfection, and existence is inside that, so therefore God has existence. That's the conclusion that it arrives at. Okay, so you're not going to debate the first premise, because that's sort of that's how we define God, right? We list all those attributes of God. One of them is perfection. Okay. The second premise is where people have historically debated this argument. It says existence is a perfection. So the argument that I told you guys about last year was, I said, can you imagine the most perfect ice cream? Okay, the most perfect flavoured ice cream. All right, you can imagine it in your mind. And so then the question is it more perfect if it exists in your hand? Because then you get to eat it. All right, and so that's sort of where you can argue that existence is a perfection. Kant, he suggests existence, it's not a perfection, but it's something that we can't offer as a predicate, and that's what we're doing here. So that was his take on this argument. All right, so we wouldn't debate the first premise, but we can go after the second. Anyway, Descartes uses this argument, and so the conclusion here arrives that God exists, and therefore I can trust my senses and build up my whole worldview from there. Okay, so that's the rationalist approach. It's not that it rejects sense experience, but it says rational faculties are more fundamental, and we build up our whole philosophy from there. Okay, so then let's talk about Hume's understanding of empiricism and the empiricists. They have, fundamentally, you emerge into the world as a tabula rasa, and that means a blank slate. You come and you don't have any ideas about the world, you don't have any knowledge, you don't have anything. And all you do is you're exposed to all of this sense experience. All right, and so, this, like I was describing to you guys the other day, my son, he's figured out how to turn the lights on and off. He thinks it's hilarious. He's figured out, press the button, the lights go on, press it again, the lights go off. And so, that's the inductive experience, and he builds up from observations a general principle. If I press the button, the lights will switch on. All right, so Hume says everyone comes out as a blank slate. They don't have any preconceived ideas. All right, and it's through induction that we learn about the world. And so one famous example is of pool balls or billiard balls on a pool table. You can think, if they're travelling together, all right, and they're going to hit one another, what's going to happen? All right, and Hume says you only suppose what's going to happen because you've observed something similar to this before. You've observed balls colliding, and you've seen what happens when they collide before. However, if you had never seen billiard balls before, and you had never seen them travelling together, you would have no idea what was going to happen. You wouldn't know whether they'll pass through one another, or combine to form a bigger ball, or one maybe might bunny hop on. You've got no idea. You only suppose that because of your previous inductive experience of the world. All right? From when you're a very young baby, from when you're that blank slate, you observe how physical things interact with one another, and from there you can infer, well, when they collide, they're going to bounce off one another. They're not going to merge, they're not going to pass through one another, because you've got sense experience which informs how the world operates. So that's Hume's take on empiricism. All right, so that's it. So we've got Descartes and the rationalists. They say we need reason fundamentally to help us inform sense experience. One of the things Hume famously said that we'll look at is if something cannot be verified with sense experience, throw it in the flames, okay? He's a bit like Nietzsche, taking the hammer to physics, to metaphysics. He says, if all that analytical philosophy, that's rubbish. Commit it to the flames, okay? We need things that we can observe, because they're the only real things. So yeah, the contrast there between Hume and Descartes. Cool, any questions? All right, so we'll stop the video there.